Hello, welcome in. My name's Scott Turner. I'm the executive director of Eternal Vigilance Action. I'm really glad to take the opportunity uh, to bring you up to speed on what happened during this legislative session. Our goal here is to offer the general public an insight into how we got here, what we're dealing with, and what could potentially happen in the coming weeks and months as a result of some of the election decisions the legislature has made, really in all of the state government has made at this point. So I'm going to go through sort of a timeline and also explain to you what the current state of the law is and really the kind of conundrum that we find ourselves in as a result of the fact that the legislature didn't take action during this past legislative session. So, a little bit about us. Eternal Vigilance Institute is a 501c3. It is the educational arm of Eternal Vigilance Action, which you may be more familiar with, but this is a project of EVI, which is a separate entity. Our mission is to educate citizens, strengthen democracy, and inform public policy with facts. We are made up of former state lawmakers with an interest in policy here in Georgia on various policy expertise areas. So, what are we doing here today? We're going to look at what SB 189 requires and why the July 1st date really matters in the world of election policy. We're going to talk about what local election officials have been telling our legislators for the last couple of years about making any types of changes to the law. We'll talk about what the legislature did and what they didn't do, and again, why that July 1st deadline is kind of looming over us, and what comes next, and why we will probably, and I say probably, have a special session of the legislature to deal with this issue. And that may become pretty apparent to you as we go through this. So, what is SB 189? SB 189 was a really big omnibus election law. It attacked all kinds of different issues, some minor, some big, the things like created an OCR audit pilot under the Secretary of State's office so that we could look at the human readable text from our ballot marking device generated ballots, and a whole bunch of things. It's 24 pages, but the section that we're most concerned with is section 7 of SB 189, which alters the way ballots are tabulated, and it has an effective date of July 1st. So that's why that July 1st date is so important. It actually removes the ability to tabulate ballots using anything like a QR code or a machine mark or barcode or those types of things. The Once it takes effect, the counties who conduct our elections are no longer going to be allowed to tabulate the results using that QR code. We're all familiar as Georgia voters. We walk up to our ballot marking device, we make our selections by touching the screen. It prints a ballot. Each race has the name of the person that you're voting for, and then it has that QR code. Well, our scanners don't read that human readable text. They use the QR code to determine who wins. And then there are back end processes to verify that the result, like the risk limiting audit, the OCR audit. And those things can be really helpful in making sure that the machine count and the actual ballots match and the results match. So that's what SB 189 Section 7 does. And the official language of that is in lines 228 through 231 of the bill, which you can read there. It's pretty straightforward. But what it didn't do is it didn't change any of the other existing requirements for our methods of voting. So this means that for our day of election voting, our advanced in-person voting, any type of in-person voting, ballot marking devices are still required by the law. Those ballots are also still required to be tabulated using scanners. And it did not actually remove the QR code or those machine type marks from the ballot. It simply said you can't tabulate using that QR code. So the way the law is currently written and will remain in place is in this box here where it says elections in the state of Georgia shall be conducted with the use of scanning ballots marked by electronic ballot markers, BMDs, and tabulated using ballot scanners for voting at the polls or for absentee ballots cast in person unless otherwise authorized by law. So that otherwise authorized by law has two very narrow exceptions. And we're going to get into that. But that is what it didn't do. So there's a lot of misperceptions about what SB 189 was. Oh, they were not allowed to have QR codes on the ballot anymore. That's not the case. It also did not require a hand marked paper ballot. It did not change anything about the law other than the tabulation process. And that distinction's very important when we start talking about the law. So let's talk a little bit about are those otherwise authorized by law. The other narrow exception is in OCGA 21-2-334. And I shrunk it down a little bit, but it's in the yellow box here. If a method of nomination or election for any candidate or office or of voting on any question is prescribed by law in which the use of voting machines is not possible or practical, or if for any other reason the superintendent, which is our county election supervisors, may arrange to have the voting for such candidates or offices or for such questions conducted by paper ballots. Essentially, this is the emergency backup. And there's been a lot of discussion around whether or not this gives the locals and even the state election board the opportunity to step in because the legislature failed to act and begin working on their own accord for a workaround, but not so fast. So for the not possible or practical is probably something that's going to be litigated if it's allowed to get that far. And I think it's really important also to note this is a grant of authority that belongs to the superintendent only. The legislation, the law is very clear on this, that they get to make the call. And it even goes so far as to say for any other reason. That's pretty broad, but that's the authority that's granted to the local superintendent. That authority does not belong to anybody else. So imagine for a moment you had 159 counties and they all did it somewhat different. That's sort of the chaos that we're going to be dealing with if this isn't dealt with. So the state election board gets their supervisory and rulemaking duties out of 21-2-334, but this is an operational decision that is clearly in the superintendent's hands. So if a paper ballot fallback is sort of triggered under this code section, it's the superintendent's call to make. And they're all asking for help. So SB 189 created this conflict between the law and our current ballot tabulation process. Ballot marking devices produce that QR code ballot. It's important to note that our current ballot marking devices, the Dominion voting machines, are only capable of producing a ballot that does have human readable text, which is required even under SB 189. But it's only able to produce a ballot with that QR code on it under our current configuration. There were no appropriations by the legislature to fix that. There was no opportunity. There's just clearly not enough time for that to be updated to make it operationally different than what we have today, which is simply a ballot that produces the printed name of the person you voted for and that QR code. So that ballot is then scanned using that readable code. It's only readable to that machine. And the counties are really reliant on well-established and certified workflows. And that certification takes time. That's not something, the workflow itself is a certified process. So it's not just something we can wave a magic wand and expect it to happen right away. So SB 189's intent was simply to move away from the QR code tabulation, count the human readable vote record, and require statutory it would continue to require statutory clarity on the replacement process because it didn't change anything else. And because SB 189 didn't alter the ballot marking process and BMDs meet all other requirements of the law still mandates that they shall be used. And it is possible and practical to use them to produce a paper ballot. So that is something I want to really highlight for you. uh, since SB 189 did not eliminate the use of ballot marking devices at all, and we can still produce a ballot marking device, the law, I believe, says it shall be conducted that way. SB 189 didn't change the way that we cast our ballots. It changed the way we tabulate. And that is a very important distinction to make. So how did we get here? Well, back in 2019, when I was in the legislature, we had a big debate around a bill called HB 316, which mandated the use of ballot marking devices statewide. Georgia was the first, and it remains the only state, to use a uniform ballot marking device across all jurisdictions for election day and in-person voting. It was a bumpy rollout. So by the time we get to 2020, there were very long lines. We were making national headlines for how long it was taking for people to vote. And the system became under attack at that point in time, really. But then we had, obviously, the really contentious presidential election here and the 11,780 vote margin that President Biden had over President Trump. And we just saw it get attacked left, right, and center. The legislature reacted to a lot of the issues that were exposed by that rollout in 2021 by the passage of SB 202, which also made national headlines for a whole other set of reasons that we're not going to go into today, but because we're going to remain focused on the issue at hand. But in 2024, the legislature enacted SB 189. So this has been on the law. This has been on the books for 2 years. In the meantime, the House and the Senate and the Secretary of State's office and even the governor's office have all weighed in at certain times with certain points of view on what should happen next. But the House of Representatives took last year to create a House Blue Ribbon Committee, and it held 6 hearings around the state. And then we'll talk more about them in just a second and what they found. But also, we had this legislative session this year. Nothing happened. We're weeks away now from a July 1st deadline, and nobody knows what's going to happen next, to be honest. So what did the local election officials say to the Blue Ribbon Committee? So the Blue Ribbon Committee did this really interesting thing. They invited election officials from around the state, and several of the members would ask questions about, do you think it's possible? Is it feasible? Is it something that you can do if we acted really early in legislative session to still meet the July 1st deadline? And nearly universally, the election officials who presented to the committee said no. These are all direct quotes from the hearings that were recorded. You can go back and watch those. I watched every minute of those, so you don't have to. But here are a collection of quotes. Noah Beck from Polk County: I don't believe the implementation of 189 at that July 1st drop dead date is possible. Ethan Compton from Irwin County: with all the steps required, this could not be done effectively by July 1st. Deidre Holden from Paulding County: I don't think that's feasible, and I know it's not affordable. And Joseph Kirk, Bartow County: any large-scale rollouts should be scheduled for an off year in 2027 to avoid major election cycles. Obviously, this year is a midterm election. So that is, we'll talk about that here in a second too, about how the current election calendar will interfere with the July 1st deadline. So this is what the study committee really saw coming. Election officials were repeatedly warning them that deadlines do not implement themselves. And they didn't have the tools, they didn't have the statutory guidelines, they didn't know how to deal with this operational and legislative mismatch, statutory mismatch. And they really were asking the legislature for more time. That was repeated over and over again. So that testimony also gave them the warning that if they're forced into using some sort of emergency backup procedures, then it would be a huge cost to the counties to deal with that. As you know, our elections here in Georgia are funded and run by our counties. So it is a local burden. It's a local tax burden. And it is something that especially smaller counties, struggle with to make sure that it is being done in a well-funded and effective manner. So we come into the 2026 legislative session, and there was a lot of debate between the two and a lot of negotiations between the two chambers on which direction we should go. And we ended up with each chamber passing a piece of legislation. And the first was the Senate. The Senate passed, well, they attempted to pass a version of what they eventually passed, but it failed on the floor on crossover day. They didn't have enough votes to even pass it with just Republicans. So later in the session, they passed HB 960, and we'll go with them first because they got their bill passed first. But essentially, what that bill did is it created a hand marked, pre printed paper ballot that would be in effect on July 1st. They retained the ballot marking devices for disabled voters, which is a Help American Voters Act, or HAVA, federal requirement. It made sure it clarified that the official count was based on non-QR machine marks while allowing for timing marks. So you'll see on ballots, some vendors will have like little black dashes at regular intervals down the side. That's so that the machines can figure out who you're voting for. And it also included more public voter list disclosure, including the list of eligible voters before advance voting began and the list of electors who cast ballots after the polls closed. And if there were discrepancies, there were fines, monetary fines attached to each instance. And then it expanded manual recounts in the post-election audit process. And it also took the audit process away from the Secretary of State and gave it to the state election board. And that was the gist of what 960 did at a very high level. The House of Representatives, hearing the calls of the folks who run our elections, took a different approach. They took SB 214, gutted it, and added their own language to it. And the biggest point of contention between the two chambers is the very first bullet point here. It delayed the implementation of removing the QR code for tabulation until January 1st of 2028. That's the biggest point of contention. There's probably really two, but this is the biggest one. The Senate really wanted to have something in place by the 1st of July this year, but there had been no money. There's been there's very little time to do a turnaround to train up everybody on a new system. And so the House decided that they would take that extra time to allow the new Secretary of State to select the system. It created a committee made up of legislators and subject matter experts to advise the Secretary of State on purchasing that system, and would also give the legislature time to appropriate the funds. It would be basically a holistic change to what we experience today. It would keep the BMDs for disabled voters, but the crux was, instead of pre-printed ballots, it would be a ballot on demand style. So you would be able to walk into your polling place, you would show your ID, they would look at the poll pad and make sure that you were getting the correct ballot. They would print the correct ballot for you. You would go and hand mark that ballot and drop it into a scanner. It doesn't actually use the words specifically hand marked in the law, or in the bill, but I think it's important to note that technologically, when you're using a ballot on demand printing style, that is the way ballot on demand works. It would also keep the official tabulation tied to just that human readable text and not any type of QR marks. And instead of taking all of the audit away from the Secretary of State, it only took the OCR audit pilot away from the Secretary of State and gave it to the state election board. So the two major differences here are the start date and the ballot on demand versus pre-printed ballots, both of which would be hand marked and tabulated using a scanner. So that's the two bills that we saw. The House did pass theirs on a bipartisan basis at over 130 votes in the House. It was a purely partisan vote in the Senate. Only Republicans voted for that particular bill, and they both crossed over, but neither chamber took up the other chamber's version. So the House did not vote on the Senate version, and the Senate did not vote on the House. So we have no enacted transition plan. There is no funded replacement, and there is no consensus on the fix. And the result is that we're heading into July 1st with legal uncertainty and operational risks. I talked about how if we leave this up to the superintendents, they could implement 159 different plans. Each would have to have some sort of risk that would need to be mitigated in a myriad of ways that we can't possibly anticipate. So the key unresolved disagreements, again, are the implementation dates and pre-printed ballots versus ballots printed on demand. So how does this collide with our election calendar? Well, we have our primaries in May 19th. We have a lot of contested primaries that have more than one candidate running. For example, governor in both parties. So it's very likely that we will see both Republican and Democratic primary runoffs that will end after certification sometime in late June. That means all of our election officials right now are working towards making sure that primary election is run very smoothly and goes off without a hitch. They're not able to take on the project of implementing something on July 1st and changing everything. And you may think, oh, well, that's okay because there's no election until November. I'll remind you, there have been at least a dozen special elections in Georgia so far this year. So that is problematic from their point of view. They need time for procurement. They need time for testing. They need time for training. And they don't have the ability to do all that right now because their bandwidth is stretched because they're already running election right now. Early voting starts in just a couple of weeks from where we are right now, and they have to get ready for that. They don't have the ability to go and do this implementation of a whole different way of voting and counting ballots this time. So that's why a special session is certainly on the table. And it may be the only legislative vehicle left to address the deadline in time. And to understand, here in Georgia, the governor can convene a special session. The timing of that is unclear. There are political aspects to this as well. So in Georgia, while the legislature is in session and you're in elected office in the executive branch or in the legislature, you're not allowed to fundraise. It makes it really hard to campaign for your own reelect. So that May 19th primary date is sort of looming over us. And I haven't talked to any legislators who are really excited about coming back while they're trying to campaign for their own reelections. But that's the only way, really, you can delay the deadline or clarify through legislation any type of compliance. And the most important thing is appropriate the money to get the fix going. The executive branch doesn't have the ability to appropriate these funds. So the Secretary of State cannot do it on their own. The state election board cannot do it on their own. The governor, I guess, could potentially try to find some free money someplace, but not likely. So absent any type of action, that conflict remains unresolved until either the courts get involved or there are those chaotic emergency administrative workarounds. So anything that we do, it has to be verified. It has to be tested. We have to define how ballots will be marked, how they'll be cast, and how they'll be counted. And it has to be funded. There has to be a timeline for reasonable implementation. At this point, we're just, again, weeks away from July 1st. The election officials almost uniformly, there are exceptions, but the vast majority of them are saying to the legislature, please give us time to do this the right way. And anything that we do come up with should reduce legal risk and mitigate the possibility of litigation. So if counties are forced into an emergency backup procedures to remain compliant, the superintendents are making that call and they're doing it independently. I mean, they could get together, they could try to share best practices, but there's nothing that requires them to do that at all. They're empowered by that language I showed you earlier to sort of deal with this, but I don't know that that's the wisest course because of the chaos it would create. Rapid changes in elections really, we learned this lesson after HB 316. We tried to rush the implementation of using ballot marking devices, and it really bit us. That's why we saw really long lines. There were training issues, and there was COVID too, but that's just part of the one of the variables in that equation. There were a lot of different reasons why we experienced uh, difficulties rolling that out. But one of the main takeaways from the lessons we learned during that period was we cannot rush these things. And uncertainty invites litigation for sure and erodes public confidence. Winners will have their victories questioned. And when winners have their victories questioned, the legitimacy of the government is in question. And that is something that we here at EVI are genuinely concerned with. We want the people to be able to have confidence that their elections were done the right way. So there are a list of questions that I think the legislature specifically needs to answer. What counts as a lawful compliance for SB 189 in July? What's the transition plan for all 159 counties? Who's paying for it? And on what timeline? How do we train workers and inform voters without disruption? And if a deadline shift is needed, what is the least risky path? And I think for me, that's the legislature taking action. So we'll open it up to Q&A if you guys have questions. I do see some questions here. Daniel says, am I understanding correctly? Essentially, the law now states that ballots be counted in a manner inconsistent with how ballots are cast. So there's two different concepts, and it's a bit of nuance, but there's two different concepts at play here. The first is how we are marking our ballot. And that law says we must use ballot marking devices. SB 189 says you can't use the QR code to scan or tabulate off of the QR code. You can only do it off the human readable mark. So the ballot marking devices still remain practically usable because they will generate, according to SB 189, something that is compliant with it. It will give you a ballot that you can read yourself and see who you're voting for. The second part of that is the operational disconnect. The scanners that we have will only read that QR code ballot or a bubble in style ballot, but it can't be done based upon the only ballot that we have available to us from the BMDs. So the question becomes, how do you count them? And that's the disconnect. Michael writes, I know it may not be relevant anymore, but do you think the current law that created the situation was resolving a problem, or was it a solution in search of a problem? If there wasn't a major problem, then does delaying a year or two make more sense? So I have a lot of personal experience with this because I was in the camp of we should be using hand-marked paper ballots back in 2019. The problem is not that the ballots are corrupted or that the system is flipping votes or that people shouldn't have confidence in the system as it exists. The problem is that there are a lot of people who do anyway. And that erodes confidence in the election. So the problem is, are enough people feeling like their votes don't count? And that's having a chilling effect on their willingness to participate in the democratic process by casting their ballots because they're thinking it doesn't matter anyway. So that, I think, is a legitimate problem that can be solved here. So that's my take. And I know a lot of different people have different opinions on there, but that's what I think. Amelia asks, what was the problem they were trying to solve? It's the same. What about 11th Circuit decisions that say SB has the duty to ensure elections are conducted lawfully? That's the thing, is there's this conflict in the law, right? So the law says we have to use ballot marking devices. The law says we must use tabulators. We have tabulators that can't count the ballot marking device ballots. So we're looking at either fixing that legislatively or going back into court. Are you aware of a cost analysis impact on counties using the legal backup ballot system? I'm not aware of any type of study that has been done on that. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist for sure. I don't have knowledge of every single thing, but I have heard from election officials that using that process is more expensive. I don't have an actual dollar figure to tag to it though. Chris asks, assuming no legislative fix and assuming no court challenges, the idea that the votes will be made based on the existing QR system and the registers will count by hand. That is certainly a possibility, but think about that for a moment. We're going to have uh, a couple dozen contested races that we're going to have to deal with, or each at least a dozen, if not up to 20 different races, including our local referendum, local ballot questions that each voter in November will be tasked with deciding about on their own ballots. You're going to have to go through every single ballot, and then you're going to have to sort them by ballot styles. This is one of the big challenges logistically. A ballot style is when you go to vote in your voting precinct, you may live across the street from somebody who votes in the same precinct as you. And the person across the street from you may vote for a different city council person than you. They may vote for a different House rep or a different senator than you, depending on where the lines are drawn. But precincts can have different style ballots. So logistically, when you show up to vote, you are given your voter card that you slide in the BMD today, and it pulls up the exact ballot that's right for you. But counting by hand ends up with this scenario where you have to sort those different ballot styles first, which is going to take time. And the Cab County said yesterday at the state election board meeting that they're going to have over 650 ballot styles just in one county because of all the different races in the May primary. And that number it'll reduce down to a couple hundred by the time we get to November. However, they have to sort those first, and then they'll have to go through and count every single race. And so now you're touching the ballots a bunch of times because you're going to end up going through that sorting process and then counting every single race. So counting by hand is definitely something that would add time and potential chaos to the process. Kate asks, would using ballot marking devices and doing the official count using OCR technology be a workable solution technically and legally? So this was one of the things that the House had contemplated before final drafting of SB 214. And there became concerns because the OCR software is sort of in the cloud, and it became a point of contention of, do we want to allow a cloud vendor to have access to our ballots? And so there was a security question that remained resolved. And so the OCR audit process for official tabulation was rejected because they didn't feel comfortable with that. Legally, no. You cannot legally at this point. It would require a change in the law to use the OCR as any type of official tally. Victoria asks, can Kemp issue an executive order to continue the current process law until the legislature can make a decision? Well, I think anybody who is the head of the executive branch can issue an executive order attempting to do anything they like. However, it doesn't make it lawful or constitutional. And anything that he would do at that point, if he were to issue an executive order, would be contradictory to the law. And I don't know that the governor's really has an appetite to do that at the point. I think he'd be more likely to call a special session. Kathleen asks, what is the least risky path? If the legislature convenes a special session, what is the concrete action that can and should be taken? What is their most cost-effective way to proceed? So as far as risky, it's always look. I used to tell this have a tree outside my legislative office window, and if it had leaves on it, it meant that your wallet was safe. That the people of Georgia were free from the legislature, and when the trees didn't have any leaves on it because it was wintertime and we were in legislative session, your wallet was at risk. And I say that sort of jokingly, but the reality is it risky? It depends on the timing. I think you can mitigate the risk of a special session if the timing is after the primary. I think a lot of this got wrapped up because in the fact that you had multiple people running for statewide office while being members of the legislature, and that had a negative impact on the outcome. That is my opinion. Others may have a different opinion, but I think if you brought them back, especially since a lot of them will have either already won their primaries or they will have lost their primaries for those statewide offices, that it may be an easier environment to work with. Again, but there is a certain amount of risk on if they come back into session, are they able to agree to something? If they're not able to agree, this is going to court. And the last time the state election board ended up in court, I actually filed an open records request, and they spent over $250,000 on outside counsel because they refused to. Um, they've refused to listen to the attorney general essentially and follow their own legal advice. Daniel says, "Is there an incredible cohort asserting that we just hand count the ballots created by the BMDs?" Well, there's certainly some folks who are advocating for that, and they will show up at state election board meetings, actively encouraging the state election board to try to regulate their way out of this. I don't know that your mileage may vary on credibility. Whitney asked, "Does the current vendor have the ability to create an optical scan style ballot? Is that just a matter of funding?" So yes. However, it requires a huge amount of time and effort to update the machines. So there is more up-to-date software that will cost money, which has not been appropriated, and it will take time to get all the machines updated. And there's a sort of question in the legislature's mind, if we're going away from QR style ballots anyway, do we want to just replace the machines that we have and go with a whole brand new system? So it's possible, yes, but it will cost a pretty penny. And do we want to spend that money for something that's only going to be used for 1 or 2 election cycles? Lawton asks, "Does an unfunded law make it unable to be enacted, or is it a situation where the governor SOS's office could figure out a way to fund it?" Uh, no. The law is so in lawmaking, many times you will see somebody add a provision to a piece of legislation saying subject to appropriations, meaning that the law does not go into effect unless it has been funded. That does not exist with SB 189. SB 189 is the law as of July 1st. Section 7 becomes law on July 1st, regardless of whether or not it is funded. Could the governor SOS figure out a way to fund it? It's a lot of money. Certainly, the Secretary of State doesn't have the authority to do this at all. He's not. He doesn't have a slush fund that he can go tap for the tens or possibly $100 million it would take to do that. The governor has access to the rainy day fund. I don't know, but again, what is he? The law specifies ballot marking devices. So is he going to be using money out of that fund to go and buy a whole brand new round of ballot marking devices? Yeah, I'm not sure that solves the issue either. So, Whitney asks, "Why not central count?" This is a chain of custody question that comes up from time to time. Um, and there are advantages for speed and accuracy results of getting things done inside the precincts. Gene asked, "The legislature could not agree in 40 days. How high is your confidence level a special session will change things? How have the fundamental positions changed?" I sort of touched on this, I think, a second ago when I was talking about if it's timed properly after the primary, that it would relieve some of the political pressure some of the members are feeling. So I think that's the biggest variable that would work on our favor. It's not a guarantee, though. Betsy asks, "I hear the Republicans are working on an even more radical version of SB 960, but also Burt Jones is planning an end run that would be outside a legislative session." So I haven't heard that about SB 960. I did see a letter that the lieutenant governor sent to the state election board yesterday, where he was basically telling them they had the authority to do this or to fix this. And we just sued. The Internal Vigilance Action sued the state election board over that very type of concept. And I can assure you they do not have that authority. So I don't know what the lieutenant governor was thinking by sending that letter. I haven't spoken to him or any member of his team about it. Michael asks, "What do you think the chances are that he will try and do more than fix the issue in a special session? Try and slip things in." That's always a risk. Uh, that's one of the risks that we would have to be willing to take, and there would be work for us to do in that. David asks, "Scott, what is your solution right now to just push back the timeline?" I supported SB 214, and that was me. And Eternal Vigilance Action, our C4 branch, supported SB 214 primarily for a couple different reasons. And you got to understand too, I was the only Republican in the legislature back in 2019 to vote against HB 316. And I said at the time that there would be too many people that would question the results if we allowed for QR codes to be the official source of tabulation. And I went back and I watched some of the hearings after I testified to the state election board yesterday because I had a bit of post-traumatic stress. Like I was feeling all these feelings I was feeling back from that time period, because when you're the only Republican to vote no on something that is a Republican initiative, it's not a comfortable place to be. And so back then, I was pointing out, it's a sort of prescient. We're going to be at this point. I said in 5 years. It's taken a little bit longer than 5 years for us to get to a point where people want to get rid of the QR codes off of the tabulation. But all that said, I've been working on this for over a decade. If you go back and listen to the testimony in committee, you'll hear members over and over again say my name as, we want to thank Representative Turner for bringing this issue to the forefront, because I've been working on it for so long. The 214 timeline is the most responsible timeline that we have. It gives the election officials opportunity to prepare. It gives our procurement process the opportunity to play out in a manner that is the best value for the taxpayers. And at the end of the day, we get a system that is familiar to every voter in the United States, because everybody has taken a standardized test at some point in their life. The ballot will feel just like that. 71% of Americans vote using that style of system. And I think it would lead to greater confidence. So just pushing the timeline isn't what I would advocate for. Pushing the timeline and using that effectively for the voters and for the taxpayers to get the best possible solution in place is the best plan. And I think 214 of the two offered that. Stephen asks, if this is punted for the time being and it then becomes governor, how do you think the dynamic on this question changes, if at all? I really don't think it would. And the reason why is because the Democrats have always been advocating for a hand-marked paper ballot. It was the Republicans who wanted the Dominion voting machines in Georgia. And the Democrats have maintained their position. They would like to do a hand-marked paper ballot. So, but the real problem with that is that governor wouldn't take office until January, and we have a whole midterm that we need to run in the meantime. Matt asks, forgive me if covered, have you heard anything about any drop dead date fix from the counties? From a practical point of view, it seems like there would not only be the legal timelines, but also availability of vendors, staff, et cetera. This actually came up during the state election board meeting yesterday, where one of the members of the state election board pointed out that there aren't enough vendors prepared to meet the demand by November. I don't know the veracity of that statement. I haven't done any type of independent verification of it, but that's sort of in the same realm. So that's what we have for you guys. I think that's all the questions out of the Q&A. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Scott Turner, Internal Vigilance Action and Internal Vigilance Institute, and I'll leave you with this one simple closing thought. Election stability is built months in advance, not in the final weeks before a deadline. Hopefully you have found this to be informative. If you'd like to reach out to me, my email address is here, turner@eternalvigilance.org. Alternatively, you can reach me at eternalvigilance.us, and our website is eternalvigilance.institute.org. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. I hope you found this informative. And certainly not entertaining, but informative, and that you found value in it. Thank you again. We'll catch you next time.